I think the Team England player partnership is one of the most fundamental things that happened. There is always a concern that at the top of the game, the players, those players who are well remunerated don't need the trade union, which people tend to see to be for the less successful players. What Team England showed, and keeping it all within one umbrella of the PCA, was that no matter where you fitted along the spectrum of players, there was something for you that the PCA and Team England could provide. So when you moved into the Team England player partnership, you got an awful lot of better treatment, enhancements in terms of salary and revenue and the way that you were looked after and managed, and also dealing with central contracts and things like that. But it meant that when you dropped out of the Team England player partnership, you were still part of the PCA and you were still part of the same body. That was fundamental to the success of the business. It created, and the union, it created, great cohesion and great sort of sense of purpose across, I think, the whole of the actual number of players, the 400 players that we had at that time. And it just meant that people wouldn't be able to say there's nothing for you from the union. There was, regardless of where you were across that spectrum, there was something for you that the PCA and Team England could provide.
The employer realised that the whole playing force was united, and the creation of the Team England player partnership achieved that. So overnight, the PCA had much more power in terms of negotiation, and the ECB were brought to the modern day.
Probably the most important impact on the PCA in terms of putting the organisation on several ladders higher up. It came about because Dean Headley and a lawyer representing Harbottle and Lewis, who were at the time working for the pool of the Team England players, were unhappy on a number of fronts. And we came together, we talked with the PCA executive, the lawyers and the England players, and we thought this is an opportunity to really promote central contracts, to promote representing players' collective issues on every aspect of the pitch, generating much significant revenues, working with the ECB on their sponsors, delivering the game some new ideas commercially, and it was and has been a major success. I think it's one of the most important structures in associations in the history of sport.
It wasn't well received by the ECB. I think they were concerned that we would be going after their sponsors. I think they were concerned that they would have collective bargaining agreements. They would have more problems with industrial relations. In fact, what they found was completely opposite. What they found was that the players, as a unified collective voice, could add a lot of value into their existing relationships with their sponsors. They could do the player appearances, they could do a lot more of the media things. It was a much more responsible way of dealing with it. They also found, the ECB, that it meant that when they wanted to negotiate central contracts, they had one central voice that could do that, rather than having to try and do a central contract and negotiate with 15 or 20 different agents. So I think fairly quickly the ECB realised that this was a benefit to them and a benefit to the game, and it wasn't something that was going to be divisive or disruptive. And that was really good news, because that was exactly what we'd been saying to them for a while. You know, we are trying to be as professional about this as we possibly can. We'll show you the value add. We know how to act responsibly in our negotiations, and they found all of that to be true.
The change came when, in 1999, Nasser Hussain became captain of England. And instead of going into the England Wales Cricket Board's offices for an important meeting on contracts and the future of potential central contracts, the players decided that we would not go into the building as employees, but they would have to come to us. And we walked over to the long room, and the ECB, 5 representatives came from the ECB. That was Lord McLaurin, Tim Lamb, Brian Ford, Brian Havel. And the individuals were pretty shocked, I think, that the players wouldn't come into the building. And from that meeting onwards, it became far easier to talk professionally and maturely around the table about how we, the players, could enhance the commercial product offering, and at the same time, the players get a bigger share of the cake that they were delivering to the game.
The PCA did get quite heavily involved with other international players' associations, particularly Zimbabwe. What had happened was that we demonstrated the value and the support that we could provide to our players, and we got a phone call from one or two of the senior Zimbabwe players because negotiations and relationships with their board had broken down and were at a pretty low ebb, so much so that they were very close to just going home and not playing in their first ever test match at Lord's. And we had to be locked in a couple of hotel rooms over a couple of weekends, negotiating with their board. We managed to sort out some of the problems that the players had, address those issues, and thankfully the test match at Lord's took place and was a great success. But it was very, very useful to be able to say, this is what we've done for our players, this is what we've done domestically, and now we can help you internationally, and then prove that we did. And I think that it wouldn't have benefited anybody, the game at large, or the Zimbabwe players, or the Zimbabwe board, if that test match had been cancelled. And that was a real possibility, so it was very good to see that, take place and be a success.
It became very obvious that there was a lot of political lobbying. Some of the players had social, there were commercial concerns, there were contractual concerns, and there were a number of discussions that led from January through to February the 13th, 2003, the final day when we had to confirm that we weren't playing in Zimbabwe in the World Cup. The England Wales Cricket Board didn't cope very well, simply because they were focused mainly on potential fines that were coming from the ICC, not actually what it was from the players' position and also the political and the supporters of English cricket and their views of Zimbabwe at the time. The players were under significant pressure, but collectively we were able to manage the situation well, and the players were able to think calmly and collectively about how best to manoeuvre their way through a very difficult political and security and social issue of whether we were going to be playing in Zimbabwe. Members of Parliament were standing up daily and saying we shouldn't be going. And David Morgan, Tim Lamb and myself met with Jack Straw, the then Foreign Minister, in Westminster, along with Tessa Jowell, the then Secretary for Culture, Media and Sport. And there were a number of interesting conversations in those meetings, but in the end there was no decision from government, so the decision came back to the ECB. They knew that the players had grave reservations on a number of fronts, but equally they kept not making the decision simply because they were very concerned at the ICC fining the ECB 3-4 million US. The players and the England Wales Cricket Board should have had more trust in each other to have been more open with the problems. So the threats from the so-called sons and daughters that the South African authorities told us didn't exist until it did appear that they were Rhodesian farmers making threats in this country. Basically, it was a poor leadership and it was poor discussions. And if a number of the issues had been more openly discussed, we probably would have got to a better situation much quicker.
Our aim in the Team England and the PCA was to try to take as many of the distractions off-field away from them as possible. And if you look at things now that are normal, they certainly weren't in those days, like provision for wives and families, for creches for the players' children. I can remember quite a few years ago where one of the England players, his wife had a terrible labour, and he wasn't allowed back from the tour because that wasn't done in those days. Now it's very normal, isn't it, for people to say, we know you're missing this test match because the family takes priority, and the England team and the ECB look after their players in a way that they should do in a responsible 21st century. But it wasn't always like that, and I think that NASA particularly really understood the need to separate the on-field activity and then allow other people to take care of the off-field work. So Richard Bevan rang me and asked if I would do the first security visit to India. It was just after 9/11. And one of the things that's significant about that is that you have to start the process somewhere, and that really was the start of the process to the way that the England team is managed and looked after. Now it's quite well received and known that there is a security officer, that people plan their travel arrangements. Those things didn't happen at that stage, and they had to have started somewhere, and they started with that. It was an interesting experience to be involved with, because some of the England players had said, this is going to be my only tour ever. Whatever happens, you've got to make sure that it takes place. Some of the players were saying, make sure it's cancelled because my life's worth more than that. And some of the players were able to say, look, we'll trust the report that you make, and we've mandated you to go and look after it and find out what the position is out there. There were some quite good learnings that came out of that. For example, the appointment of a couple of security people to look at an awful lot of the logistics and the way that the team travel, particularly at the pinch points where there might be security risks, particularly going from hotels in buses to grounds, things like that. And I think that did a lot to alleviate concerns that players had. And again, that tour took place and was a great success.
When you see the way the England boys came together in setting up of the Team England player partnership, I think it galvanised cricket as a whole. Every player that's playing for their county, it's their goal to play for England, and they saw the way that the England boys got together with the PCA's involvement, and I think it helped bring all the players in all change rooms, because they could hear what was going on. They would hear from their one or two England players that were involved at the time how, speak very positively for the way that it was being set up and being run. And like I say, I think it really did galvanise us as a union that this was happening, and not just for the elite, but for the youngsters of tomorrow, etc.